What's going on, guys? Welcome back into the channel. Today I have yet another important video for you guys, and we're going to continue the theme of fantasy drafts here with this video as well. We're going to kind of build upon what we've been discussing in the prior videos, talking about various different tips for fantasy drafting, and specifically talking about factors that are important long-term for your team, things that will contribute to long-term success. And one of those factors is going to be your team's salary. You know, knowing how much your players are getting paid, how long they're signed for when you draft them, you know, what you're going to have to re-sign players for, various different factors that kind of contribute to your long-term success of your team. It's kind of pretty important for you guys to know what's going on with your salaries and the breakdown of all these different things. And so we're going to cover those in today's video. With that being said, we're going to go ahead and get into the first one. We're going to talk about the general basics of how long players are signed for and the amount of money that they're actually signed for. So if you take a look at the roster breakdown here for the players that I drafted here, you guys will see pretty clearly that their overall and basically what round they were drafted in and things like that line up pretty directly with what I'm paying these players. Obviously, I've ended up with some steals that are making less money even though they're a higher overall player and things like that, but it's very important for you guys to know how much players are making when you draft them and how long they're signed for, because this can influence whether you're, drafting, too old of a player or something like that, or it influences your young players, your ability to re-sign them, and so it's very important. So first things first, let's look at our first overall pick, Aaron Donald. Aaron Donald, or I should say first round pick. Aaron Donald is signed to a 5-year contract, and he's signed to roughly $12 million per year. So the first thing that you're going to notice here is that most of your players, the high-end players especially, are going to be making significantly less money than they would be in a regular franchise mode. So this is a win. Whenever you draft a player like an Aaron Donald or a Fletcher Cox or an Evan Ingram, and they're this high of an overall, they wouldn't be demanding this low of an amount of money in a regular franchise. Now, doing a fantasy draft, you get the benefit of having these players on cheap contracts for somewhat of a long period of time. So 5 years is pretty significant, but this is what's important to know about that 5 years. So I drafted two 29-year-old players. So these players might not survive through that 5 years of their contract. Let's say, for example, you drafted a 32, 33-year-old player at a similar position or something like that. You're going to be having that player signed through a 5-year contract. Couple things factor in here. Number one, they could regress to a point where that contract could be not worth what you're paying them. You're overpaying the player because a couple years down the line, they've regressed to a point where they're not as useful as they used to be, and you're paying them too much money. So that's one important factor to consider. The other important factor to consider is you want to take advantage, and if you want to have long-term success in your franchise, you want to take advantage of the fact that these players are on cheap contracts. So you want to draft players that will be around for the 5 years that they've been signed to their contracts, because that is maximizing the value on that player. So you want to pick a player that can survive through the year 2024 here, for example, because I'll be getting the most bang for my buck out of that, maintaining cap space to be able to re-sign other players. So let's talk about that, for example, for a second. The top 5 players here, you guys can see, have 5-year contracts. Beyond that, most of the players are signed for 4 years or less. So you guys will see a lot of my players here are signed for 4 years or less. Then you start to get down into somewhat of the backups territory, or the lower end players that are signed for 3 years. Very rarely are you going to have players that are signed for 1 year. Those are kind of the bottom of the barrel players, the deep end of the roster, the backups. I mean, these are players that would be 1 year type of players, your undrafted free agents, stuff like that in a regular franchise. Nothing surprising there, and they're all signed on cheap contracts. So this means one thing especially important for you guys. number one, up at the top, you're going to want to look at the cap space. You guys have $100 million in cap space right now, and that's going to go up in the future because none of these contracts are backloaded, so you have to keep that in mind. All of these contracts are flat rates the whole way through the life of the contract, and so that means next year I'm still going to have $110 million in salaries. However, what's going to happen is that salary cap is going to go up. My cap space will increase, but the other thing to note is that in order to sign your backup players, you're probably going to end up paying all these $500,000 players probably quite a bit more than they are making now, and a lot of these players you're actually probably going to replace with high-level rookies, say your first-round pick or whatever. They're going to fill the roster spot that one of these players would, and so that your cap space is going to start getting taken up more and more as the franchise progresses. But that $100 million in cap space is really crucial because you will sign players, and you probably drafted players that you're going to want to sign to long-term contracts. If you're following the strategy that I gave you guys, you're going to have a lot of players here that are young. You're going to have players that are going to be up for negotiation on contracts in 2, maybe 3 years, and that cap space number is going to be extremely helpful for you. So that is what you want to take advantage, and you want to keep that cap space number pretty much where it is, because if you've drafted a younger team, you're going to need to re-sign your Deontay Johnsons, your Mecole Hardmans, your Terrell Edmonds. You're going to need to sign them to big long-term contracts by the time they hit that age or they hit the end of their contract, because of the fact that at that point you will have developed them into really, really good players, high-impact players, probably X factors at that point, and they will start to be phased in to the high salaries on your team as you're phasing out the higher overall players on your team. So those are a couple of the important points, is that number one, you don't want to draft older players to these 5-year deals. In the first 5 rounds or so, maybe even 10 rounds, you probably don't want to draft really old players because you're not going to maximize the value on these players. Looking at an Aaron Donald making $12 million, I want to maximize how much I'm getting out of that player, and so if I drafted anybody pretty much over the age of 30, I'm running a severe risk of cutting off a couple years of that contract and ending up costing myself in the long run. So make sure you guys are drafting players that are old or young enough, rather, that they can survive through the length of their deal. And you're not going to want to cut these players because they do have bonus amounts that are going to hamper your team from being able to sign players. But one of the things that we kind of also need to talk about is the fact that, yes, you have that $100 million in cap space, but one of the other implications of that is that you're not going to see free agents. I mean, not the likes of a normal franchise. Unless somebody just gets cut because somebody doesn't want a player that they drafted anymore, you're not going to be signing big-time free agents or anything like that. Or maybe somebody cuts an older player, I don't know, but you're not going to get, big-time impact free agents out there on the market. And so you want to reserve that money that you have in your franchise, specifically in your team. You want to reserve that $100 million in cap space to re-sign these players a couple years down the line. Like I said, the Deontay Johnsons, Hardman, Edmonds, because in a couple years they're going to be up for negotiation, and you need to be able to balance those things. One of the things that you guys need to pay attention to as well is the fact that these $500,000 players, all of these kind of replacement level players, there are quite a few of them, and like I said, a lot of these players will get replaced with rookies, but replacing these guys can be difficult. So you may want to consider re-signing these players to a long-term deal if they're a player that you like, because you have the money to do so. And even if you just signed them to a 2 or 3 year deal, at that point then they're going to be renegotiating at the same time as your other players that you are really developing, like the Deontay Johnsons that I talked about, and then you can choose to let them go at that point. There will be more of the draft classes that will have an influx of younger players in the league, and at that point you'll probably have more players to replace with, but it's going to be hard to find replacements for these guys. Don't just let them walk into free agency, because like I said, free agency in a regular league, because of the fact that everybody has so much cap space and everybody has their good players locked up for long-term deals, you're not going to see pretty much anybody that good in free agency. You're not going to be able to replace these players with anybody better than what you've already drafted. That is a really important point because of the way that these salaries work out, the way that these things break down. That's important for you guys to know. So, if you want to have decent backup level players, I highly recommend that you guys get in there early and re-sign these guys to long-term deals, maybe even just 2 or 3 years, whatever it might be. But that is one of the other very important salary implications of a fantasy draft. Now, aside from that, there aren't too many, super important salary cap implications other than, knowing what you're drafting and how much money they're going to be making. You guys can see a very direct decrease from round to round. My first round player making 12 mil, second round player making 10, 8, 6, 5, 4, 3, 3, 2.75, 2.5, 2.25. So it's very clear on how it breaks down, and you guys can see specifically what round each player is going to be making. So first round, second round, third round, fourth round, fifth round, and so on, and then they get grouped together at that point. This will help you guys out, even if you guys just go in, take a screenshot of this for all it matters. Note down how much money each of these players are making at a specific level, and keep that in the back of your mind whenever you're drafting. Whenever I draft a player, for example, in the third round, I need to be looking at a player and I need to be looking at their value and saying, hey, if I draft this player, am I going to get 5 years worth of $8 million play or better out of that player? That's what you need to be thinking when you draft those players. That's one of the biggest implications. And if you look at a player and you can say, well, I'm not going to get 5 years of $8 million worth of play out of them, then don't draft that player. Make another choice. Make a choice of a player that you can get $8 million worth out of them for 5 years. Like I did with Aaron Donald, I had to make a choice. I did pick a little bit of an older player, but knowing that he's a 99 overall X factor, he will stay around for at least 3-4 years of this contract. I think I can get 5 years out of it, but I did take a little bit of a risk drafting a 29-year-old player. Now, being that they're a higher overall as a 99 and Fletcher Cox being a 96, I think that they'll stay at a high enough overall that they're not going to be retired at that point. But, you kind of have to weigh the cost-benefit relationship of having that player. So maybe for me, having that 99 overall player for 4 years on a discount is just as good as having a 90 overall player or an 88 overall player at $12 million for 5 years. Getting that extra year isn't necessarily the most important thing for me, because I would rather have Aaron Donald, the 99, the most impactful player, for 4 years. So that is something to consider as you're drafting the player. If you can have these salary tables in your mind, or even if you just have a picture or you take a note of it while you're drafting, or you're trying to work your fantasy draft, this can help you make a decision on which player to draft. And like I said, once you start getting to a 29, 30-year-old player, you start to run the risk of that player not being worthwhile for the term of their contract, and it's going to be hard to replace that type of player. That's the type of thing that you guys need to be thinking about. Hopefully this helps you guys out in some way. One of the first things that I do whenever I do a fantasy draft is I take a look at the salaries. Anytime I do any franchise, really, I look at the salaries, I look at the breakdowns, I try to find what's the most cost-efficient way to run the team. And when I've done fantasy drafts in the past, I take a picture, a screenshot of a salary table like this, and when I'm going through the draft, I utilize it to help me or aid me in making my decision on who I'm going to draft. So like I said, hopefully this helps you guys out in some way, or at least get you thinking along the lines of managing your salary and being successful long term, because you've set yourself up financially to be successful in your franchises. If this does help you, make sure you guys leave a like on the video, comment down below with what you'd like to see next, and subscribe to the channel. And if you're new, I'll see you in the next video. Hope you guys have a good night.